Hello, everybody. My name is Frank, and you are watching Motley Meanderings. I want to thank you for taking the time to check out my channel. In this episode, I'm going to walk through the steps it takes to install a set of Baja Designs LP6 lights onto a Jeep Gladiator with a steel bumper. Baja Designs is based out of San Diego, so I know the company well. I know their reputation of building very high quality lights, and I've always wanted a set. I could just never justify the price. But knowing the quality, I figured I might as well go on and put a set on. The packaging was solid and everything seemed well wrapped and well protected for transport. Thick brown paper was used to protect the sides of the light boxes themselves and seemed to work well. I believe you can buy these lights separately or as a pair, or in my case, I bought a full kit, specifically for the Jeep Gladiator and Wrangler JL with the steel winch bumper. One thing to note, if you do get a kit like this, don't let the paper fool you. There's other stuff besides the two lights. I found both my wiring harnesses, and I didn't know there'd be two wiring harnesses, but we'll get to that later. But anyway, the two wiring harnesses were also buried in the paper, so don't forget to check everything before you decide to throw away the trash. And a bag of zip ties, which I thought was a nice touch. And just to be sure I didn't miss anything, I pulled all the paper out, checked the bottom of the box, and made sure there was nothing else buried in there before I got rid of the box. And there it is, the gold standard of off-road lighting. So going back to the wiring harnesses, the one you see here was a backlight add-on kit. So basically that was the amber light, the daytime running light that's supposed to be with the light. Then you had the regular lighting, wiring harness that works on several models of light. So that explained why there were two wiring harnesses. The challenge with that was I had absolutely no idea how to install two separate wiring harnesses yet. The lights themselves were very well packaged. They were protected by a dense foam around both the top and the bottom of the light. The light was packaged with a plastic film over it to protect the bulbs in addition to that. And with the light, you also had the light bracket and the mounting hardware for that specific light. Everything felt noticeably robust and well made. One thing that was immediately apparent was the quality of these lights. They were heavy, they were solid, they just felt really, really well made. From front and back, the cooling vents, everything about it just screamed quality. Now, something unique to my install is I actually already had a set of lights mounted on my bumper. These are the MOPAR 5-inch lights, and honestly they've worked fine. They're also well made. They don't have the brightness of the Baja Designs, and they also don't have the angle light. They also don't have the daytime amber running light that the Baja Design has, which I really think is a nice touch. They are quality lights though. I had to figure out a way to take these off and remove the wiring harness and everything before I even got started putting in the new lights. As you can see here, Jeep gives you a lot of options. Each one of those bolts you can remove and put an accessory like a light. So you've got a lot of options on how you mount the lights. I have the Jeep Upfitter switch, light switch system in mind. So those wires you see there actually come from the factory and you can plug in to run lights, which is how I wired the original light. So my first thought was I will just undo that wiring and then do the same thing with the new lights and run them into that switch panel. Physically removing the old lights was very simple because they are a Jeep product. They use metric, so a 13mm socket and a 13mm box wrench was all it took to pull these lights off. Again, I used the factory Jeep bolts that have cage nuts on the backside to mount the frame for the lights, and those come off with a Torx 30. My original thought was to mount the new Baja Design lights in the exact same spot as the MOPAR lights. I couldn't remember exactly how I traced and had all the wiring hidden under the Jeep, so just to be on the safe side, I decided to remove the skid plate, which is actually another very simple operation. 17 millimeter bolts, again, no nuts on the back side. There's 5 in the front and 2 in the back. You can pull the 5 off from the front with the without the bash plate falling down on you or coming forward. So once you get that done, the last 2 I just wedged up under there with my knee and held one side with my knee and then loosened the other and brought the 2 down. As you can see here, I just loosened the one on the passenger side, and then using my knee to wedge up against the skid plate, I removed the one on the driver's side, and my knee held it all in place. And then once that came out, I could go ahead and remove the one on the passenger side, using my hand just to hold it in place, and it fell right down very gently. Easy. I then turned to uninstalling the old wiring harness from the MOPAR lights. There were a lot of zip ties that held it all in place and tucked in, but fairly straightforward job. And once I started to kind of separate it all, I could see exactly where they had all been run. I mean, it was pretty easy to remove from there. MOPAR lights only had a lead and a ground, so it was a 2-wire system, so pretty easy to operate on. Then the final step was just simply to remove the wires from the switch of the Jeep itself. The next step was to mount the light brackets for the new Baja Design lights. So, as I mentioned earlier, my intent was to put them exactly where my old lights had come off. So, I mounted the brackets there on each side, and that was, again, very straightforward because, again, it's just a T30 that torques right in, so nothing to it. The Baja Design light brackets actually have a slight angle to them, so you can position the lights backwards or forwards depending on how you turn those. All the mounting hardware was included, and it was very intuitive on what bolts went where. There are a couple of mounting holes on the lights themselves on how you want to mount them. And then on the side, on the bracket themselves, there's an angle so you can position the lights up and down at an angle depending on how you want to set the light height. So it was at this point that I realized the lights would not work where I'd originally wanted to put them. They were blocking the red recovery hooks, and I didn't want to block those. I don't primarily use those, but I didn't want to be able to totally block them, and where the lights were, you couldn't even get a rope over them. So I ended up moving them to the front here, and honestly, now that it's done, I think I like it better anyway. As a note, I did use hand tools, 7/16 wrench, in fact, to mount the lights. I didn't want to use electric tools on this, not knowing how sensitive the threads were. I definitely didn't want to take a chance on stripping a thread or somehow damaging the lights. I think they came out pretty good. They look good on the front of the bumper. Now, of course, the challenging part was how to wire them in. The main wiring harness actually looked pretty straightforward. There was a switch, which I honestly wasn't expecting. I thought I bought the upfitter kit that would wire right into the Jeep switch panel, but apparently it has its own switch. There was also a relay to adjust the power, so that made sense to me. There was a hot and ground, which went to the power source, so that made sense to me. And then there were two plugs that went directly into the light. So the wiring harness seemed pretty straightforward. The two plugs look like they should just push directly into the back of the light, so I didn't see any challenge there. But I was confused because there was a bag that had another plug kit, apparently to make your own plug, so I didn't understand that fully. To be on the safe side, I laid it out on the ground, and there were the two plugs that went into the light, which made sense. They were equal length. That went up, and you can see the hot and ground wire, which obviously goes to the battery, positive and negative. And there's a relay right next to that. And then the other long wire at the end was to the switch, which would have to go through the firewall and into the dashboard somewhere if I wanted to route it that way. It was the second wiring harness that was really throwing me for a loop. I bought these lights because I really liked that backlit add-on, the amber daytime running light, but I had no idea how this fit in with the rest of the system or how it worked. So I took it apart and started kind of looking at it and trying to see if I could figure it out. The first thing I noticed was there was a bag full of blade fuse wire clips. These things are designed to go into a fuse panel, pull a fuse out and stick these in its place, and now you have a wire coming out of them. But there were like 5 of them, so it took me a second to realize that, of course, they had one for every type of fuse made on a vehicle or an off-road vehicle, so I realized that I'd only need one. And again, they had additional plug kits to make custom plugs, which was kind of scary. I didn't want to get into the business of making my own plug if I could use the one that came with the wiring harness. Cutting up factory wiring harnesses has always made me nervous. As I continued to unravel it, I noticed there were 2 kind of metal stems that were identical, so I assumed those went into the light since they're 2 lights. And then at the back there was also like a quick disconnect. I couldn't figure out what that was for, but I assumed you could just splice into an existing 12-volt wire on the Jeep. My epiphany came when I actually started looking at the wiring diagram and seeing that there were 4 pins that went into the connector. That kind of lit everything up for me because I realized when I looked at the connectors that were already there were only 2 wires going into it, a white and a black, which the wiring diagram described as the hot and the ground. There was an ability for 2 more, and I learned that one was for the daytime running light, which was an option on my light set, and the other was for a high beam, low beam kind of setup, which my light kit did not come with. So sure enough, there was just a little rubber plug that was in the back of the plug, and everything started to make sense from there. The wiring diagram said that the daytime running light wire went into position 3, so I pulled out that rubber grommet for position 3 and pushed the new daytime running light wire into the plug itself. Very simple. I then wrapped some electrical tape around the new yellow wire so it would hold in place, and then began to feed the wiring harness down through the engine bay to get them so they would line up with the lights and I could plug in the plugs into the back of the light. I have a tool that consists of a long flexible wire with a thumb button on the back end that opens up some clamps on the front end that you see here that allows me to fish wires down through tight places where your hands don't fit. It works really well. Before I started to get formal with everything, I wanted to test the lights, especially with that new daytime running light wire that I'd put in there. So I went on and wired up the hot and the ground to the battery just to give an initial test, and then if they worked, I'd go on and permanently mount the switch and clean all the wiring up from there. At this point, I had the one wire now that I knew was going to go into the fuse box, but I didn't know exactly how that was going to connect because the wiring harness had that quick connect on it. It didn't seem like it would work with the blade fuse that went in there. And then I just generally laid where the switch was going to go because it would have to run across the entire length of the firewall and then through the firewall. The hole in the firewall on the diesel is on the driver's side. So I just roughly laid everything out to see how it looked like it was going to fit. So within my fuse box, I found the fuse for the cigar lighter, or the accessory port, and I thought that would be a good one to use. So I also, looking at the fuses, I realized that mine is the micro blade, so I discarded all the rest of those little wires except for the one that matched the fuse that I had just pulled out. So now I knew which wire to put into the fuse box. And that blade has an additional little port to put the fuse that you pulled out back into it. So here on my fuse panel, there's the fuse that I originally pulled out. And now with the new blade, both the original fuse and the new fuse for that wire are installed in that one spot. So at this point, about the only question I had left was how to connect that wire into the wiring harness that had that quick disconnect that looked like it was supposed to shunt into another line. Then as I sat there and looked at it, I had another epiphany. It looked like that wire would just pop right out of that kit. And sure enough, it did. And looking at it, I go, wow, that'll fit right into the wire. So hats off to Baja Designs for making a very, very simple system to wire. And it was so simple that it took me a while to even figure it out because I was expecting it to be a lot worse. So with that, everything was now ready to test and see how it works. So I buttoned up the big stuff and just kind of left the wires hanging loose at the moment, but went on and plugged them into the lights to give it a good test. So I gave myself enough reach where both of the plugs would reach the lights with a little bit to spare. And they plugged right in, so that was very simple. So now was the moment of truth. With the switch just sitting there on the hood, I just thought, well, let's see if these things work. So I flipped the switch, and sure enough, the lights came on, which was good news. Now, interestingly, though, the daytime running lights did not come on, but I assumed because I didn't have the battery on. So I went into the truck, got the battery turned on, and while the lights were working, I still didn't have a daytime running light. So something wasn't working right, and that was a bit disappointing. I even tried turning the engine fully on and turning the lights on just to make sure, but knowing that it was a cigarette lighter, that shouldn't have been an issue. Either way, it still didn't work. So from there, I grabbed a circuit tester, plugged it into the ground where the rest of my ground wires are, and tested that wire coming out of the fuse to see if it was carrying electricity. It was, so the wire was hot and it was working. So the next step was to go back and look at the plug again and see what maybe I did something wrong pushing that wire into the plug. And as it turned out, I did need to take that plug apart to get that yellow wire to fully seat. So I did that, and I found that I had not pushed that yellow wire in deep enough to make contact. So I put it all back together and tried again, and a much different result the second time. You can pull the back of that plug off with just a small blade screwdriver, so it comes off really easily and then snaps right back into place. So again, a very simple operation. So now with everything working properly, all I had to do was continue to run the switch into the cab and tighten and button everything up with zip ties and clean it all up. And speaking of zip ties, I have a very large zip tie that I use for just this kind of project. I pulled the fuse before I pulled these wires off, and then I saw where they were in relation to the on and off button, so I knew how to put them back together. I used electrical tape to tie those 3 wires into that zip tie, and then just slowly fished it through the firewall hole. It took a little bit of work. It bound on everything, but with a little bit of patience, you finally get it, and it'll come on through. I decided to use the panel that snaps on under the steering wheel to mount the switch. I thought that would be the cleanest to do. So I ran the rest of the wire through the firewall to give myself enough room to work, and then I had to drill a small hole into that little piece of plastic to mount the switch. I used a step drill bit to make sure that the hole was precisely the right size and I didn't over drill. So it was nice and tight in the plastic, and then it was just a matter of hooking the 3 wires back up, slapping that panel back in place, and start cleaning everything up with zip ties. And here's the finished switch on that panel below my steering wheel. It's easy to access, turns on and off, and I think that's going to be a good solution that's clean and doesn't tear up the truck. And the finished product, I ended up taking the 5-inch lights and putting them up on the sills. Everything worked. I think it looks really good. It's clean looking. And at night, a tremendous amount of light coming out of those things. Really happy with them. And again, the amber lights that are kind of the daytime or nighttime running lights, I think really look good on that. And I'm really happy with the way it turned out. So while it took me a while to work through and solve all the wiring issues, it turned out to be much simpler than I had originally planned. And if I'd known that, it would have been really simple from the beginning. So again, hats off to Baja Designs for designing not only a great light, but a very simple and customizable wiring harness so it will fit any and all needs, and for just generally making an incredibly high quality line of products. If you found this video helpful, please consider subscribing and giving it a thumbs up. And if you have any questions regarding the install or comments, please share them in the comment section. And as always, thanks for watching, and I really hope you found this helpful.